Well, even though it might have lagged in the middle of it, that was a good finish, wasn't it? And even though Max got another win, he had to fight for that one. The look on his face when he was in the press conference, him slouched over, looking like he was about to fall asleep. This is the look of a man who had to go all out to really show what he could do in that car. This was a great example of how he and his crew can come back from a very tricky Friday practice stint and come out on top, and why he was a very big winner here today. Had the race been a couple of laps longer and his tyres continued to wear down, I think that Lando could have had him. Catching up with the car is one thing, but trying to overtake that car is a whole other matter. Nevertheless, this was probably the hardest victory that Max had won in a very long time. This race proved to us all that even though Max did come out on top, he had to go all out to even maintain the status quo of him winning. According to many statisticians, there's only a tenth between Leclerc, Norris, and Verstappen. I think after all of this has gone down, Max needs to buy Hulkenberg a beer. After getting that toe, he gained 2/10 in that first sector alone and gave him that pole position, which meant that he could hold station at the front and keep Norris behind him. If not, we would have seen a McLaren front row right before that miscommunication, but I'll get to that later. Yes, of course, the season hasn't been blown wide open, but it's been blown open to a certain extent, meaning that in the right circumstances, and especially in Monaco, whoever gets pole will go on to win it. And that'll make the predictions tomorrow a lot easier. But it means that there's a certain amount of jeopardy to be had. And this will show that if Max can come back from all of this and win this title, it'll make him an even better driver. So well done, Max. You came back from a really tricky Friday and doing a 24-hour sim race, and you still won. Wow. And if we can see Max at full power throughout the rest of the season, it's going to be a really good season to watch, even if he is dominating. Putting Ferrari in the winners category, it was a bit of a tall order. Yes, they did come out with a really good car, which is a lot closer to the Red Bulls, especially Verstappen. It has eclipsed Checo at the moment, but all of the hype before the weekend really oversold what they could actually do. Ferrari allowing the photographers to take pictures of the SF24 Evo many days before the Grand Prix even took place, it really sold the hype that it was real, that the Ferrari was going to completely eclipse the Red Bull, where it ultimately didn't. But it was certainly a lot closer. Saying that they gained 3/10, and then Carlos Sainz says the media overhyped it. Well, it's not the media's fault this time, Carlos, it's your team, allowing all of that to happen and allowing the media to get ahead of itself. However, the race pace was still really good, and Charles was catching Max as well as Lando, albeit not as obviously as the McLaren. As I mentioned in previous videos last week, it had to be Leclerc being the more dominant Ferrari driver. And throughout this weekend, it was. And if he can carry this on, it's going to be a very good year for him to really establish his place as the lead driver of that team, instead of allowing Lewis Hamilton to come in with the red carpet, the really red carpet, and just allow him to take over. We might see him transform into the driver that we saw back in 2019 and summer 2022, when he was able to take the fight to Max, but only this time, he'll have Lando to deal with as well. And I think that was also helped by the fact that Piastri was out for revenge against Carlos, and he was able to get him in the pit stops and therefore keep Carlos behind him, because throughout the first stint, Carlos was really hounding Charles. He was probably saying, "I'm faster than Charles, let me through," but then he fell back and then Piastri took him and then he wasn't able to get past the McLaren driver, so Charles also got a little bit of an extra break there. And another thing that will make Charles happy is that he's second place in the championship now. He's managed to leapfrog past Checo. Oh yeah. Extra brownie points there. He'll be feeling really pleased with himself. And yeah, he also has to remember that, yeah, with that new puppy of Leo, yeah, you got to pick up after your dog. You've got to have plenty of these in your pocket at all times. And even though this brand new car wasn't enough to get on top of the Red Bull entirely, it was a very necessary one to keep in the fight with McLaren. Now, speaking of McLaren, wow, 7/10, that was crazy. We all thought that Lando couldn't hack it against Max and that he was going to lose by maybe about 10 seconds and then we would have returned to the status quo, but no. We saw some really good things happening with the McLaren's tyre management. And that meant that Lando was able to dial it back a bit and then come back at Max again, and Max had no answer for it. It was just time that beat out the McLaren, unfortunately. But remember, trying to topple Max himself will be extremely tough, especially when he's feeling vulnerable. Like I said, tyre management was a little bit of an issue at points where Lando said that he had no pace, but it seems like it is an issue that McLaren are getting on top of. Their race pace is incredibly mighty, especially on the medium tyres, and also it's something that's allowed Oscar Piastri to be able to show what he can actually do. We saw a little bit of what we saw in Miami, where he was able to keep up with Verstappen, and it just made me think, oh, if only the team had communicated with him about Magnussen, he might have still been on the front row. When it's been Verstappen versus Piastri, Oscar is not afraid to try something. And of course, it might lead to an accident, and then Oscar might have been out, or Max might have been out, but it would certainly been very, very spicy. But one thing is for sure, regarding Lando, him getting his first win has unlocked something. It's given him a taste of victory. He knows exactly what he has to do in order to do it. I doubt that the Lando of last year would have been able to really bring Max back in to within DRS range like that. Because I think the best example, was in Interlagos last year, where Lando was in second, he couldn't get anywhere near Max, and he didn't really try. But either way, Lando did have the car to go up to him, and he was genuinely disappointed. That really tells you a lot with the status of that team. That team is looking very, very close to getting its best finish in the Constructors since 2011. And second place is very, very plausible. Lando needs to be aware that Oscar will be responding. In fact, he did respond during qualifying. He, had it not been for that toe of Hülkenberg, would have been on pole. And that would have meant a lot. And an all-McLaren front row with Oscar in the lead position. You bet that Stella and Brown would have been near Brown trousers time if something went down. And that would have easily been a flashpoint. But fortunately, or unfortunately, Kevin decided to ruin the party. Okay, no, joke. McLaren would just drop the ball in terms of communication. But it could have been really spicy. I've got to talk about Yuki Tsunoda. Even though he only ended up with 1 point at the end of it all, the entire weekend was a very pleasurable experience for the Japanese driver, considering that Checo was out of position, and Stroll managed to get something out of the upgrades, as well as the extended tyre stint, and he actually managed to sort of mitigate the benefits that Aston Martin had with their upgrades. They only scored 1 point more, thanks to Tsunoda desperately hanging on to that 10th place. And also, Tsunoda avoided potentially a very major gaffe that would not have gone down well with the higher up board of Red Bull, in the fact that he did hold up Max quite a bit. He lost a second behind Tsunoda and allowed Lando to continually catch up to him. But Max went on to win anyway, so that'll probably be forgotten. He is channeling his inner Gasly as being the team leader of that team, because clearly Daniel's not doing it. In any case, it was a very calm weekend where quite a lot of the time, Tsunoda was pumping in loads of really impressive lap times that were right up there, at points, the fastest Red Bull driver. That was bonkers. That's almost as impressive as what Lawson was doing in a much slower car at Singapore. He's responding to the potential threat of Liam Lawson being in the wings for next year, maybe. But either way, I think Tsunoda's really come out of his shell, and this was a really good example of him not wanting to let his hometown down, because Tsunoda is a very popular figure around Faenza and the Emilia Romagna region, because, yeah, this was technically Racing Bull's home circuit. I will say that this was a really good weekend for Mercedes, and I will tell you why. Because there's a very interesting chart here about the overall race performance of the W15. It's getting closer. They have done the business in pulling away from Aston Martin. They just need to find a couple of more tenths, and in terms of race pace, they will be up there with the big three. And that is interesting. Even though Russell came in with some medium tyres, fresh ones, and he got the fastest lap, it did skew the results. It's certainly still a very respectable performance for the W15, even though it was nowhere near a podium. But that's sort of off limits for the time being, considering how close those top three teams are. Mercedes are getting there. It's just going to take a little bit longer. They just need that last couple of extra tenths, and then they can easily scrap, especially if one of the Ferraris or McLarens or Red Bulls falter, sort of like we saw with Checo. They were able to get the jump on the Mexican driver and get themselves a really solid result, definitely solidifying themselves in 4th place. They should be really happy with this race, and they were able to even try that kind of maneuver of bringing in George, going for the fastest lap. That's not a team that's been able to do that as of late, trying to do cheeky pit stop strategies to try and bag an extra point. They've been trying to fight for their lives for the first few races. I've been telling you throughout the entire season, they will figure out this W15. They will improve. It'll take some time because they've changed the car for the 3rd time in this development cycle. whereas all the other teams have been steadily evolving. They have the facilities, they still, for now, have the manpower, and who knows, we might see 4 teams in the mix. And I bet you, 4 teams being in the mix for a win, or some decent podium finishes, it's still better than 3. Now we get to the meh category, and just about missing out on the winner's spot is Lance Stroll. Oh, okay, alright, I see it. Okay, you are just doing what everyone else is doing and bagging on Lance. No, I'm not. Lance Stroll did good. The pit stop strategy where he extended his first stint worked like a charm. It brought him from 13th to 9th. Aston Martin came away with something, and it was Lance to do it. Credit where credit is due. But the reason why I put them in meh instead of the winner's circle is because this is not what Aston Martin expected with the upgrades that they brought. Thanks again to F1 Big Data, they brought an effective B-spec car. And what did they get from it? They're back to where they started at the beginning of the season of the 5th fastest car. But now Mercedes have pulled away. The gap between them and Racing Bulls is now much bigger and skewed in the favour of Racing Bulls. And this team has piled in heaps of time, money and research into trying to be up there with the big leagues as they were last year. And yeah, okay, it's good that Lance came away with some points and was a lot cleaner than Alonso. But the team should not be fending off Racing Bulls and Tsunoda. But nevertheless, it was a solid weekend for him. But even he said so himself, that car is not competitive enough. It really isn't. And this was their major upgrade, whereas all of the other teams around them brought smaller upgrades and got more out of it. I'll talk more about Aston Martin in a moment. Now, Red Bull. Even though Max Verstappen won the race, he had to dig deep. It goes to show that the Max factor made all the difference between Red Bull winning and not winning. In fact, you could say at some points during the race and the weekend, the Red Bull was the 3rd fastest car. Wow, 3rd fastest. It's been a long time since we could say that with some confidence. But I will say that they are still an incredibly good team and an efficient one. Their pit stops, still bulletproof. Them being able to respond to the issues that Max was having on Friday with the setup, they came up with a really solid result. And even though it did result in very concerning front tyre wear, which meant that the tyres were too cold, and then Max was staring a 5-second time penalty in the face, so he had to be even more careful so he couldn't use the tyres more aggressively, it meant that the tyres got even colder, so that means he couldn't turn properly. And there were many other issues that were really concerning Red Bull, because last year they had a car that was chef's kiss. This year, it's not looking quite as solid. And I think this race has given them some cause for concern, because as I said during the season, Checo has had a very solid start, but if the other teams do catch up, he needs to improve even more, or else he's going to be completely swamped. And it's already begun. And if this continues, and Norris continues to pump in podium after podium, then it's going to be a straight-up fight between Verstappen, Leclerc, and Norris for the title. Even though Norris might fade away, Leclerc might fade away, Max might fade away, we don't know yet. But having 3 drivers in with the chance of winning it, and maybe even Carlos catching up, and maybe Piastri showing a thing or two for the future, oh, it's going to be good, but it does mean that Checo might start to be really getting concerned, and now Tsunoda, if he can continue. That might make my prediction of Tsunoda and Verstappen at Red Bull a little bit more interesting, and I'm really, really pleased about that. They got the win through sheer grit, not raw pace, and it's going to make things all the more interesting in how they respond. They brought upgrades here too, and they needed to, because if they hadn't, they would have been nowhere. Speaking of another Red Bull driver, Ricciardo. Oh, this was tricky. Now, I wouldn't call Daniel a loser here because he didn't really do anything bad throughout the entire weekend. Saturday looked really, really good. Both Racing Bulls drivers in Q3, and Daniel was P9, Yuki P7. But the thing that afflicted Yuki as well is that their start procedures were not good. They both lost positions, and that car's race pace is still something they need to work on. It's better than it was, but the fact is though, is Aston Martin did respond. Haas have responded. Mercedes responded. So their fight for 5th or 4th in the Constructors, it's going to look a little bit more tricky, but 6th is still theirs for the time being. And even though that's all very well and good, they want to beat Aston Martin. They want to give their old team principal Franz Tost the dream that he never got, and that was P5 in the Constructors. And even though Daniel had a very uncomplicated weekend, he just didn't have the raw car to give him that opportunity. And he really was not electric, whereas Yuki was pulling off some really good overtakes, especially into turn 1. My goodness, he was making overtakes where other people weren't even trying. That was really, really ballsy. Whereas Ricciardo, he didn't quite have that. But I'm sparing him the losers category for the fact that he didn't really have any idiotic gaffes. And like I said, it's a good thing he scored points last time out. Now, I was really not sure about whether to put him here or not, but I'm putting Valtteri Bottas in the meh category. Even though his race wasn't all that stellar, all the stuff around the race was something that really got my ears perking. And he did highlight a little bit, since Esteban Ocon was the darling of the F1 TV director, since when we were looking at Norris and Verstappen catching up, we constantly saw Ocon chasing for 14th. This was our 2024 equivalent of Lance Stroll during Monaco. Seriously. But there's also some really major speculation that Williams is looking at Bottas for next year, because he was spotted going to the Williams motorhome, and he was there for a good 15 minutes. And many people were talking about this, but Bottas laughed it off and saying, "Oh, I ran out of coffee." Really? Sauber having no coffee? Caffeine is what helps fuel the grid. I'm not buying that, Valtteri. And I know you do like your espresso, and I'm pretty sure that you've got a friend there in James who might know what you need, and also you might want to have a little bit of a tete-a-tete with him. And it's something that does make a lot of sense. And he did laugh it off. But that lineup could be quite useful in building up the team ready for 2026, since Bottas is familiar with the Mercedes power unit, and Toto will probably be quite supportive of the move if Williams are looking just to try and consolidate what they have and not take any risks with rookies. Then again, Vals has mentioned that he is talking to multiple drivers, and not just Bottas potentially. There's of course Kimi Antonelli to consider, and Logan, in a token way, because I think he's pretty much done, even though he got the better result this weekend and in the Miami sprint. And then, of course, to push your buttons in a subtle little way, I will, of course, consider Mick Schumacher here, because he is the Mercedes reserve driver. So if they did want to parachute somebody in, and James Vowles does push the button and does a mid-season driver swap, they might put the reserve driver in just to fill in the gap for the rest of the year. Could happen, but maybe 2025 might yield some results, but Bottas, I think, might be the more pragmatic result out of all of it. And you might be wondering why I'm really not considering Kimi Antonelli for that seat. Well, okay. This weekend, somebody from Formula Regional did get their first podium, but it wasn't Kimi. It was the guy from Paraguay, Joshua Dirksen. Welcome to the podium, and outdoing Kimi Antonelli. Toto probably is not looking all that happy right now. And you know what? I'm going to stick Kevin Magnussen in here because the guy needs a break. He actually had a pretty solid weekend. He was right behind his teammate, and he did give Haas a solid result despite Perez and Tsunoda proving too quick for them and Stroll's tyre strategy aiding the Aston to 9th. He looked a little more stable, he didn't look quite as lost, and even though he did bring down the aggressive streak because, you know, he's so clear to a race ban, it did provide us less entertainment, he did have a very uncomplicated weekend, and it was a weekend where he felt reasonably pleased with himself, that Haas were really showing themselves as the 6th fastest team at points, because 11th and 12th for Haas last year, Gunther would have been chomping at the bit for having both cars near the points. That was a really solid result for them, and really solidifying the idea that they have broken away from Alpine, Sauber and Williams, and they can easily, on some days, go after Racing Bulls and even get a cheeky scalp from Aston Martin. That is something we would not have been saying even at the beginning of the season. Kevin's really got to do the business, and he has got a lifeline considering Nico's not going to be there next year, but yeah, it's going to be a very tall order for Kevin, especially since he cannot make any more mistakes for the rest of the season unless he gets a race ban. And then Benham will get that seat, and then the rest will be history, or future history. Then we got to the losers, and Alpine is going to be one of those, I'm afraid. And I wouldn't say that this race was anonymous, but it was just something where they just lost steam. Because there were points in Q1 where Gasly was right in the top 5, and I was like, mon dieu and sacre bleu, that was really impressive. But then it didn't really amount to anything, and both drivers sort of fell away. Even though Esteban did get the attention of the media with the F1 TV director constantly doing replays of Ocon's overtakes, which in a way shows that he was making impressive moves, but they weren't exactly the points-paying positions like they were in Miami. Yes, they have scored a point. Alpine are steadily improving. But it was not nearly as good as what they did last time out, and it did sort of show us that they have still got some things to do to try and break away from the bottom 2 teams, and then even have a hope of trying to catch up to Haas. And they're looking at the reality of them losing one or both of their drivers for next year, because this year they're 8th, last year they were 6th, the year before that they were 5th, and many times they were 4th. They could maybe give one of their Alpine Academy drivers a chance, for once. And then, of course, bring in Mick Schumacher. And no, it's not me saying it this time. It's Bruno Famin himself, so go and give him some bother. I don't choose to die on many hills in this game, but this one, I will. Alpine need drivers that are team players, adaptable and not egotistical, and it's something that Bruno Famin sees a lot in Mick Schumacher. And maybe he can help dispel the negative propaganda that Steiner and Haas perpetuated throughout the entire F1 community. But again, Imola showed us that they still have some work to do on that front. They are not going to be scoring any points anytime soon, unless they have a huge upgrade where they can increase the weight reduction campaign more and more, and maybe get more out of the brand new structure that they are developing, and they're basically just copying McLaren's form book. Aston Martin were the biggest losers of the entire weekend, but wait, hang on, you said that Stroll did okay. He got 9th place, 2 points. Well, yes, that's all very well and good. But as I was recording this video, I got a notification that Papa Stroll was getting sick and tired and losing patience of the fact that Aston Martin aren't progressing as he hoped. And that is all I need to say on that front. But I will say more anyway. These upgrades, these were huge. They did what McLaren did in Miami. And even though the McLaren in Miami, they did really good and got right on top of Max, Aston Martin did not do that. And we started to see something very similar to what we saw in Canada last year, where they brought upgrades, and they didn't work. Mercedes are now over 40 points clear of them, whereas Racing Bulls are still about 20-25 points behind them, and could catch them up if they have a turn of form. And Fernando Alonso, he was a big loser as well, because this was a really scrappy weekend. And we are starting to see more and more comments that the Fernando of old was making almost every other weekend, where he was sort of disparaging his form and that he was saying, oh, I can't wait to get home and go and think of Monaco. He was done with this weekend. He was the really messy driver, whereas Lance Stroll was just quietly getting on with the business. But even he said the car wasn't good enough, and that's Lance Stroll. And Mike Cragg, the team principal, has been glowing about Lance, continually saying that he's really, really good, and that the comments against him are disgusting and unfair. And then suddenly, you see Alonso having a trickier time with the car. Where's my tin foil? I guess you're gonna have to do with, the foam of doubt. And the foam of doubt is speaking to me. What's that? All that talk about Alonso being strong-armed into signing for Aston Martin because Carlos Sainz was available? Oh, getting him to shut up about going to Mercedes? And he did do that. And now he's suddenly the worst driver in Imola? He was struggling with the car and Lance didn't? And Mike Cragg has been talking really good about Lance? Interesting. Thank you, Foam of Doubt. But don't trust him, though. Maybe this is why Sebastian Vettel left, because surely he would have carried on if he knew the AMR23 was going to be good. He would have known, but that was just not enough to keep him. What's going on behind the scenes that would have made Seb leave? And by the way, speaking of Vettel, it was so good to see him in that car. He looked like he was having so much of a good time. And then he bowed to the car like he did in 2013 when he won the title. Oh, Seb. Oh, he was so good. Please convince Formula One to use V8s only with synthetic fuels. Then I will wrap up with Alex Albon being a loser here as well, especially since he signed for a multi-year deal with Williams, and this is the way they celebrate, with a car that had a really bad pit stop, and then they DNF'd the car, and then the car turned itself off when it clipped a curb, and then they brought out red flags, and it's, oh dear. And then the car's 15 kilos overweight, supposedly, by Val's own admission. I mean, I appreciate his honesty, but I don't know why he's trying to do this. Is this trying to justify Logan's lack of performance? And then you give a couple of upgrades to Albon and you don't give them to Logan, so how is he able to try and respond and keep his seat for next year? It's really weird at Williams. And the best thing they can think of is asking James Valls what kind of toppings he has on his pizza and what he says about Hawaiian pizza. And incidentally, I do believe that Piniapoli does belong on a pizza. However, Alex isn't that pessimistic, since the team had only scored a point at this point last year, according to his own words. But I doubt they're going to be getting 7th place in the Constructors anytime soon, and 2024 is looking likely to be either very low scoring or no scoring, as Valls is keen to focus on renovating the overall widget rather than chasing places. It's not really looking good for any Williams fans, and speaking as a McLaren fan, I feel your pain. To me, this feels like 2017. 2016 provided some glimmer of hope that maybe McLaren had turned a corner with Honda, but the following year, we went back down to earth with a bump, and it feels like that with Williams here. Another thing that's come down to earth with a bump is the overall driver market, after being touted to be the wildest one in decades, even though 2 major names are still at play. And to find out why I think this and why the silly season is all but over, go and watch this video next, and leave your thoughts in the comments about this race in particular.